It was still drying on Cassian Vane's knuckles when he walked through the front doors of his estate. The dockyard raid had gone wrong in every way a raid could go wrong. 2 of his men were finished. A shipment worth more than most people's lifetime earnings was now ash floating on the harbor water. And somewhere in the chaos, a rival gunman had gotten close enough to put a bullet through the wall 6 inches from Cassian's skull. He should have been thinking about that, about revenge, about which of his captains had leaked the raid's timing to the enemy. Instead, walking into the marble silence of his own home, all he could think was that the house felt wrong. It was quiet in a way it was never quiet. Cassian had built a life designed around noise, guards murmuring on radios, staff moving through hallways, the low hum of a household that ran itself so he never had to think about it. Somewhere in that machinery was his wife, a woman he'd married 6 years ago and had, if he was honest with himself, stopped truly seeing around year 2. Soraia didn't attend his business dinners. She didn't complain when he missed anniversaries. She kept to her sitting room on the east wing, soft-spoken, always a little in the background, the kind of wife his men referred to, never to his face, as the boss's shadow. Round-faced, quiet-eyed, always in her worn velvet coats, even indoors. He'd loved her once, in the distracted way a man loves something he assumes will always be there. Lately, he hadn't loved her at all. He had simply not thought about her, which was its own kind of cruelty, and some cold part of him had always known that. He climbed the stairs 2 at a time, blood still tacky on his sleeve, calling her name out of habit more than need. No answer. The door to her sitting room was open. That was the first wrong thing. She always kept it closed, ever since the early years when his men wandered the halls too freely for her taste. The second wrong thing was on her writing desk, sitting in a small pool of lamplight like it had been placed there deliberately, waiting for him. Her wedding ring. Cassian stood in the doorway for a long moment before he made himself walk toward it. The ring was set beside a single folded sheet of paper, her handwriting on the outside. Cassian. Nothing more. He picked it up with hands that had, an hour ago, been steady enough to reload a pistol under gunfire, and found them shaking now. By the time you read this, I'll already be gone. Don't look for me. You never really looked for me before. Don't start now. I'm sorry for the years I let you believe I was someone smaller than I am. That was a kindness I gave you, and you never noticed it was a kindness. I won't be giving it any longer. S. He read it twice, then a third time, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something that made sense. A kindness I gave you. Cassian was not a man who startled easily, but something about that line made the hair on his arms rise. He looked around the room, really looked, for maybe the first time in years, and noticed what he'd never bothered to notice before. The bookshelf against the far wall sat at a strange angle, a hair's width off from the wall behind it. He crossed the room and pushed it, and it swung open on a hinge so well oiled it made no sound at all. Behind it was not a closet, not a hiding place for jewelry or old letters. It was a war room. A corkboard covered one wall, dense with photographs, hand-drawn diagrams, and red thread connecting one node to another with the precision of a woman who had done this before, many times, in silence, while her husband assumed she was upstairs sewing, or reading, or waiting for him to remember she existed. Cassian stepped closer, his pulse loud in his ears, and recognized the layout on the largest diagram immediately. The Malachor compound, his rival's fortress on the waterfront, a building so heavily guarded that Cassian's own intelligence team had spent 18 months trying to map its interior and had barely scratched the surface. Soraia had it drawn floor by floor, guard rotations noted in tight, careful handwriting, blind spots circled in red ink. A leather-bound ledger sat open on a small desk beneath the corkboard, filled with names Cassian recognized. His enemies, his allies, even his own captains, cross-referenced with dates, payments, betrayals he hadn't yet discovered on his own. His wife, the quiet one, the one who never asked questions, never left the house, never seemed to want anything more than to exist somewhere near him. She had been running an intelligence operation from inside his own home for years, and he had never once thought to wonder what she did with her days. Cassian sat down slowly in the chair at her desk, the farewell letter still crumpled in his fist, and understood, with a dread that settled into his chest like a stone dropping through water, that he had spent 6 years married to a stranger. And that stranger had just walked, alone and unarmed by any weapon he could see, directly toward the most dangerous man in the city. He didn't know yet if she'd left to save him, or to destroy him. By morning, Cassian had rehearsed the lie enough times that it came out smooth. She's at the lake house, needs quiet after the stress of the past few months. He said it to his captains over coffee they didn't drink and cigarettes they did, watching each face carefully as he spoke, the way he'd been trained to watch faces his whole life, looking for the flicker, the tell. The one man in the room who already knew where his wife really was, because he'd been the one who told her to run. Nobody flinched. Nobody looked away too fast or held eye contact too long. If someone in his inner circle had betrayed him, they were better at hiding it than he expected. Or they genuinely believed the lie, which told him something too. It told him Soraia hadn't trusted any of them either. Whatever she'd built behind that bookshelf, she'd built it alone. That should have comforted him. It didn't. He held the meeting the way he held every meeting. Territory disputes, a supplier threatening to double his prices, a finished lieutenant's brother asking for a bigger cut of the family's protection money. Cassian nodded in the right places and gave orders in the right tone, and felt, the entire time, like a man standing outside his own body, watching someone wear his face. When the room finally emptied, he didn't relax. He picked up the phone and made one call. "Cale, my office, now. Alone." Cale arrived within the hour, Cassian's oldest friend before he was ever an enforcer, the one man in the organization who'd been there before the money, before the war with Malachor, before any of it. He'd carried Cassian's father's coffin. He'd stood beside Cassian at his wedding, close enough to catch him if his knees buckled, though they never did. If there was one person Cassian trusted with the truth, it was Cale. He shut the office door and told him everything. The ring, the letter, the war room behind the bookshelf. Cale listened without interrupting, his jaw tightening slowly the way it did before violence, though there was no one here yet to be violent toward. "She never once asked me a real question," Cale said finally, shaking his head. 6 years. I thought she was just shy. So did I. You want me to find her. I want to know what she was doing in that room before I decide what I want. They went back to the house together. Cassian gave Cale the ledger, the diagrams, and, the piece that mattered most, a small hard drive tucked into a false bottom in her desk drawer, one he hadn't noticed the night before because grief had a way of narrowing a man's vision to only the things that hurt him. Cale was better with machines than anyone else in the organization. He set up in the war room itself, running cables across the same desk where Soraia used to sit and plan, and began pulling apart the encryption, layer by layer. It took most of the afternoon. Cassian didn't leave the room. He paced, he smoked, he read her letter again more times than he wanted to admit, searching each time for a softer meaning that wasn't there. "Got something?" Cale said eventually, and Cassian was at his shoulder before the sentence finished. The screen showed a log of outgoing data, small transmissions sent quietly over months, routed through 3 different relay points before landing at their final destination.
Kale traced the path with a cursor, muttering under his breath as the trail unspooled.
"This isn't recent," he said. "She's been leaking something for a long time. Look at the timestamps. Weekly, sometimes twice a week, going back almost a year. Leaking what?" Kale pulled up the payload attached to the most recent transmission, and both men went quiet. It was a travel itinerary, Soraia's own. Departure times, routes, even which car service she used and which driver. All of it detailed enough that anyone watching the file would know exactly where she'd be and when, down to the hour. "She sent her own schedule," Kale said slowly, like he didn't fully believe it himself. "To someone at this address." He clicked through to the destination, and the color drained slightly from his face. Cassian. This routes straight into Malakor's internal comms network. She wasn't hiding her movements from his people. She was handing them to his people. The 2 men stared at the screen in silence. Cassian had spent the last 12 hours assuming the worst version of the story, that Soraia had been compromised, turned, coerced, that some version of Malakor's men had gotten to her and used her against him without his knowing. That story, awful as it was, at least made her a victim. It let him be angry at someone other than himself. This was worse. This wasn't a woman being hunted. This was a woman walking toward her enemy with the door propped open behind her, on purpose, on her own terms, for reasons she'd shared with absolutely no one, not her husband, not the man who'd known her longest, not a single soul under this roof. She wanted them to find her, Cassian said, half to himself. Why would she want that? Cassian thought of the letter again. That was a kindness I gave you. He'd read it as an ending, a door closing. But maybe it wasn't an ending at all. Maybe it was the first move in something much bigger, something that had been building behind his own walls for longer than he could bear to think about, and he had been too distracted, too careless, too certain of his own wife's smallness to ever notice the fuse burning down beside him. I don't know, he admitted. But whatever it is, she didn't run from Malakor's territory. He looked at the screen one more time, at the waterfront address glowing back at him like a challenge. She ran straight into it. The rain had started an hour before Soraia reached the harbor gates, and she let it soak through her coat without hurrying. A woman running from her husband wouldn't hurry toward shelter. She would walk slowly, the way grief walks, like her body had forgotten why it was moving at all. She had rehearsed this version of herself for months. Not the woman who mapped floor plans by candlelight after Cassian fell asleep beside her, oblivious. Not the woman who'd memorized guard rotations the way other wives memorized recipes. This version was smaller, softer, broken in a way that made men lower their guns before they'd even decided to. The 2 sentries at Malakor's outer gate saw her before she reached the checkpoint, a round-faced woman in a soaked velvet coat, arms wrapped around herself, no weapon, no escort, walking alone through the storm toward the most dangerous compound in the city like she had nowhere else left to go. One of them laughed, not cruelly, just surprised. You lost, sweetheart? I need to speak with Don Malakor. Her voice came out thin, exactly the way she'd practiced it, cracking in the middle of his name like it cost her something to say it. Tell him it's Cassian Vane's wife. That got their attention fast enough. They didn't shoot her. They didn't even search her properly. A pat-down so careless it would have embarrassed Cassian's own men, fingers brushing over the outside of her coat without ever finding the seams where the buttons had been resewn, each one small enough to pass for decoration. Each one worth more to her than anything else she'd carried out of that house. They marched her inside at gunpoint that felt more like formality than threat, radioing ahead, and by the time she reached the compound's 2nd floor, word had already spread through the building. Vane's wife, alone, soaked to the bone, begging. She let them see exactly what they expected to see. Don Malachor received her in a room built to intimidate. Dark wood, low light, a wall of windows overlooking the harbor where his ships came and went untouched by law or rival. He was older than Cassian, colder in the way that came from decades rather than temper, and he studied her from behind his desk the way a man studies something he's already decided isn't a threat. "Cassian Vane's wife," he said, testing the words like they might be a trick. "In my house, in this weather, alone." "I have nowhere else to go." She kept her eyes down, her hands twisting in her lap, letting her voice shake exactly as much as a woman's voice should shake after leaving everything she'd ever known. "He doesn't know I've left. He won't look for me. He never looks for me. I've spent 6 years in that house, and I don't think he could tell you what color my eyes are." It wasn't entirely a lie, and that was what made it land. The best lies always had a true thing buried inside them, and this one had 6 real years of loneliness holding it up. Malachor's lieutenant, a broad-shouldered man named Draven, who'd clearly appointed himself skeptic of the room, folded his arms.
"Could be a trap. Vane's smarter than he looks."
"Look at her," Malachor said, not unkindly, waving a hand in her direction like she was evidence in her own case. "Does that look like a trap to you?" Soraia let her shoulders curl inward, let her chin drop, let herself look exactly as small as 6 years of being overlooked had trained her to look. Because the truth was, she barely had to act at all. She had simply stopped hiding what the role required, and the role had always been half true. "I know things," she said quietly, before Draven could argue further. "About his shipments, his routes, his men. I've listened at doors for years because I had nothing else to do with my time. I'll tell you all of it. I just want somewhere safe. I want protection, and I want him to know what it feels like to lose something he never bothered to hold on to." That last part wasn't rehearsed. It came out sharper than she intended, and for half a second, something flickered behind her carefully broken expression. Something that looked less like grief and more like fury, before she smoothed it back into place. If Malachor noticed, he didn't show it. Men like him rarely looked twice at a woman's anger. They'd spent their whole lives deciding it wasn't worth their attention. "Give her the East guest suite," Malachor said finally, already turning back to whatever business she'd interrupted. "Light detail on the door. She's not a threat, she's a resource. Draven, get someone to debrief her properly in the morning. See what Vane's careless mouth taught her over the dinner table." Draven didn't look convinced, but he didn't argue with his boss either.
He gestured for her to follow, and Soraia rose slowly, unsteadily, playing the last note of the performance as they led her through the compound's inner corridors. Corridors she memorized without once lifting her eyes, counting doors, counting cameras, marking the location of every junction box mounted along the walls with the same quiet attention she'd once used to memorize the layout of her own husband's house. The guest suite was comfortable, better than comfortable. A bed, a window, a lock on the door that was meant to keep her in, but had clearly never once considered that the real danger might already be standing inside it. Soraia sat on the edge of the bed after they left her alone, listening to the storm against the glass, and finally allowed her hands to stop shaking, on purpose. She reached into her coat and touched the row of small, unremarkable buttons sewn along the collar, cold rain still clinging to the velvet. "One more day," she thought. "Just enough time for the wiring to settle. Enough time for Cassian to find what I left him." She had spent 6 years being underestimated in one house. She intended to spend it exactly the same way in this one. The technician's shop didn't have a sign. It didn't need one. The kind of people who found their way to a basement workshop 3 blocks from the fish market already knew what they were looking for. And the kind of people who wandered in by accident learned quickly not to come back. Cassian had been here before, years ago, for reasons that had nothing to do with his wife.
He remembered the smell first, solder and machine oil and something faintly chemical underneath, before he remembered the man himself, hunched over a workbench cluttered with components too small to name, a jeweler's loop pushed up on his forehead. Cassian Vane. The technician, an older man named Pharaoh who'd outlived 3 different crime families by making himself useful to all of them equally, didn't look up from his work. Haven't seen you since the wiretap job. Your wife, on the other hand. Cassian's whole body went still. She's been here. 6 weeks ago, maybe 7. Pharaoh finally set down his tools and reached for a rag to wipe his hands, unhurried, the way men who'd survived a long time in a dangerous business always were. Paid in cash, didn't haggle, knew exactly what she wanted before she walked through that door. I don't get many customers like that. Most people come in here with an idea and ask me to make it real. She came in with the schematics already drawn. What did she want? Pharaoh walked to a cabinet along the far wall and pulled out a small tray lined with velvet, the kind jewelers used to display rings. Inside were a dozen buttons, plain, dark, the sort sewn onto the collar of a heavy winter coat, unremarkable enough that no one would look at them twice. Microtransmitters, Pharaoh said, each one no bigger than a fingernail, low power, short range, designed to stay completely dormant until they're triggered by a specific signal, which means they don't register on any standard sweep. Your security people could run a bug detector over her a dozen times and find nothing, because there's nothing broadcasting until she wants there to be. Cassian picked one up between 2 fingers, turning it in the light. It looked exactly like the buttons on the coat she'd been wearing the night she disappeared, the coat she wore almost every day, the one he'd stopped noticing years ago the same way he'd stopped noticing her. Triggered how? That's the part that impressed me. Pharaoh allowed himself the smallest flicker of professional admiration. She wanted them wired to establish a physical bridge, not just transmit data. You plant enough of these close together, say sewn along a coat collar that happens to brush up against a wall, a door frame, a junction box, and with the right activation sequence, you're not just listening anymore. You're building a relay chain, a network with no wireless signature at all, because it isn't wireless. It's copper and contact points, hidden in plain sight, moving from one anchor point to the next, until it reaches wherever she needs it to reach. Kale, standing near the door, said what Cassian was already thinking. An air-gapped system. Bingo, Pharaoh said. Somebody's got a network they've deliberately kept off the internet, off any wireless connection, precisely because it's too valuable to risk exposing. Your wife wasn't planning to hack anything remotely. She was planning to walk her way inside it, one contact point at a time, until she was close enough to touch the thing she wanted to reach with her own hands. Cassian set the button back down on the velvet tray slowly, his mind rearranging everything he thought he understood about the last week. He'd assumed, hoped, if he was honest, that Soraia had fled out of fear, that something had frightened her badly enough to run, and that somewhere underneath the calculated ledgers and the war room and the leaked itinerary, there was still a woman who needed rescuing. It had let him imagine himself as the one riding in to save her, which was easier than imagining the alternative. But she hadn't fled anything. She had built a key over months of quiet, careful work, disguised it as the ordinary clothing of an ordinary, overlooked woman, and then walked directly through the front gate of the one building in the city guarded well enough to have earned the nickname The Vault among Cassian's own men, a compound so thoroughly isolated from outside networks that his best people had never even attempted a digital breach, because there was nothing to breach remotely. Malakor's most sensitive systems didn't touch the internet at all. That had always been the compound's greatest strength. Soraia had turned it into its greatest weakness. She hadn't run to Malakor's fortress to hide, or to bargain, or to punish Cassian by proximity to his enemy. She had walked in wearing the only tool capable of getting close enough to something no one else could reach. She didn't flee out of fear, Cassian said quietly, more to himself than to the room. She went in to bridge his mainframe.
Kale exhaled slowly.
Then whatever she's planning, it's already happening, or it's about to. How long would something like that take? Cassian asked Pharaoh. Once she's inside, once the contacts are made, how long before she can actually reach whatever she's after? Pharaoh considered the question, glancing at the tray of small, dark buttons still catching the workshop light. Depends how deep the target is buried and how patient she's willing to be. But a woman who's spent 6 years letting an entire mafia underestimate her without once losing her nerve. He shook his head, something almost like respect in his voice. I'd say she's more patient than any of us. Cassian thought of Soraia's letter, still folded in his jacket pocket, worn soft at the creases from how many times he'd unfolded it since that first night. That was a kindness I gave you. He finally understood, standing in a basement that smelled of solder and old secrets, exactly what kind of kindness it had been, and exactly how little time he had left to decide whether he was walking toward her to stop what she'd started or to help her finish it. The storm that had followed Soraia to Malakor's gates 5 nights earlier hadn't broken yet. If anything, it had grown worse. The kind of coastal downpour that turned harbor streets into rivers and made every guard on every rooftop want to be anywhere else. Which was exactly the weather Cassian had been waiting for. He and Kale lay flat against the wet gravel of a service road 200 yards from Malakor's outer wall, rain hammering the hoods of their black jackets, a rolled set of blueprints tucked inside a waterproof case between them. Soraia's blueprints. Her handwriting, her red ink, her patient months of watching and counting and memorizing, now spread open under a shielded flashlight, while 2 men who loved her in very different ways prepared to trust her completely with their lives. Camera sweep resets every 90 seconds on the northeast corner, Kale murmured, tracing a gloved finger along the page. She's got the timing written right here. 91 seconds to be exact, not 90, 91. She always was precise, Cassian said, and something in his chest tightened at his own words. Not grief anymore, not quite. Something closer to awe, tangled up with a shame he hadn't finished sitting with. They moved when the 91 seconds came. The outer wall's northeast corner sat in a genuine blind spot, exactly as marked. A strip of shadow between 2 floodlights that Malakor's own security team had apparently never bothered to fix, because no one had ever tried to use it. Cassian went over first, dropping into wet grass on the other side, Kale right behind him. No alarm, no shouted challenge, just rain and darkness and the quiet thud of 2 men landing exactly where a woman's careful notes had told them they could. She was inside this place for less than a week, Kale whispered as they crossed the inner courtyard, hugging the tree line Soraia had marked as a second blind corridor. How does someone map a fortress like this in a week? She didn't map it in a week. Cassian kept his voice low, his eyes scanning the rooftops for movement. She mapped it from the outside for months before she ever walked through that gate. The week inside was just her confirming what she already knew. It was a strange thing, moving through enemy territory guided entirely by his wife's handwriting. Every mark on the page proved correct. The guard rotation at the loading dock, the exact position of a maintenance door that should have been locked and, according to her notes, never was, because the compound's engineers had complained about it for years, and nobody with the authority to fix it had ever cared enough to follow through. Cassian had spent 18 months trying to build a picture of this building with satellite photos and bribed informants, and had gotten less than a tenth of what Soraia produced, alone, in silence, while he sat 2 rooms away, assuming she was reading a novel. They reached the maintenance door exactly where her diagram promised, and it opened without resistance, just as she'd written. Inside was a narrow service stairwell, smelling of rust and standing water, lit by a single bare bulb that flickered with the storm outside. East guest wing, Kale read off the blueprint, angling it toward the dim light. 3rd floor. She's marked 2 guards on rotation, but look! He tapped a small annotation in the margin, dated only days ago in fresher ink than the rest of the page, added after she'd already been living inside the compound. She says the rotation drops to 1 guard between 2 and 4 in the morning. Budget cuts. Malacor's gotten sloppy. Cassian checked his watch. 2:17. They climbed. The stairwell opened onto a service corridor that ran parallel to the guest wing's main hallway, separated by a thin wall that Soraya's notes described as having a door disguised as a supply closet. The kind of detail no outside intelligence team could have ever gathered. The kind of detail that only came from a woman who had walked these halls herself, counting doors with her eyes down, memorizing every seam in the architecture, while men who should have known better dismissed her as harmless. The supply closet door was exactly where she said it would be. Cale eased it open, and Cassian's heart did something complicated in his chest when he saw, through the gap, the single guard she'd predicted, slumped in a chair outside a door marked with nothing but a brass number. Her door. Cale moved first, silent as the rain outside, and had the guard subdued and gagged before the man's radio could crackle with a call for help. Cassian was already at the door, hand on the handle, every version of the conversation he'd rehearsed on the drive over dissolving into nothing at all as he pushed it open. The room was empty. For one horrible second, Cassian thought he'd read the map wrong, that they'd breached the wrong wing, the wrong floor, that Soraia had never been here at all, and this entire operation had been built on nothing. Then he saw it. The window cracked open despite the storm, a length of cord fashioned from bed sheets tied off around the leg of a heavy dresser, and on the nightstand, weighted down against the wind with a small glass paperweight, a single folded note. Cassian crossed the room in 3 strides and unfolded it with hands that had stopped shaking somewhere between the outer wall and this room, replaced instead by something sharper, more focused. If you're reading this, you followed the map exactly the way I hoped you would. Good. I need 30 more minutes. Don't come looking for me in this room again. Come looking for the lights. Cale appeared in the doorway behind him, glancing at the paper, then at the open window, then at Cassian's face. 30 more minutes for what? Somewhere below them, deep in the belly of the compound, the corridor lights flickered once. A small, almost imperceptible stutter in the current, the kind of thing a tired guard might blame on the storm and never think about twice. Cassian had seen that same flicker before, in his own house, the week before Soraia disappeared, and hadn't thought anything of it either. He knew better now. For that, he said, and they moved. Soraia had been out of that room for 11 minutes before anyone noticed the guest suite was empty, and by then it no longer mattered. She'd left through the window not because she needed to escape, not yet, but because escape had never been the point of tonight. The bedsheet cord dangling 3 floors down was a diversion, a trail for anyone who came looking to follow in exactly the wrong direction, while she slipped instead through a narrow utility hatch she'd identified on her second night in the compound, disguised behind a laundry chute nobody bothered to lock, because nobody imagined a guest would ever want to climb inside one. She moved through the walls of Malacor's fortress the way she'd moved through the margins of her own life for 6 years, unseen, unremarkable, exactly where no one thought to look. The junction box was in a narrow electrical closet on the 2nd floor, close enough to the guest wing that she'd been able to reach it without crossing any of the corridors with active camera coverage. She'd found it during the daylight hours of her 3rd day inside, walking the halls with her eyes down and her shoulders curled, playing the broken wife so convincingly that Draven's men had started leaving doors unlocked around her out of pity rather than caution. Pity, she'd learned a long time ago, made people careless in ways fear never did. She knelt in front of the panel now, rain-damp fingers working quickly at the buttons sewn along her coat collar, feeling for the small release catch on each one that would free the hair-thin copper leads coiled inside. One by one, she connected them to the exposed contacts inside the junction box, a process she'd rehearsed blind, in the dark, sitting on the edge of her own bed back at Villa Vane, while Cassian slept 2 rooms away, utterly unaware that his wife spent her nights practicing how to dismantle empires with her fingertips.
The relay chain completed with a faint click she felt more than heard.
Somewhere on the other end of that copper thread, through the wall panel, a long wiring Malakor's engineers had installed decades ago and never once suspected could be turned against them, sat the compound's air-gapped mainframe. The vault behind the vault. The system so deliberately isolated from the outside world that Malakor's own men joked it was safer than a bank. They weren't wrong. It was safer than a bank. It just wasn't safer than a woman they'd let walk past it a dozen times without ever really looking at her. Soraia pulled a small device from an inner pocket of her coat, no larger than a matchbook, and pressed it against the last exposed contact point. The screen lit up with a single line of text, "Bridge established," and beneath it, a script she'd written and rewritten across 100 quiet evenings began to execute, line by patient line. She had built it carefully, deliberately, to do two things at once. The first was simple destruction: financial ledgers, laundering records, the encrypted files documenting every payoff, every crime, every deal that let Malakor's organization function above the reach of the law. All of it began to overwrite itself with garbage data, file by file, folder by folder, a slow and irreversible erasure that no backup could survive because the script had already located and corrupted the backups first. She'd studied this system's architecture for over a year before she ever set foot inside the building. She knew its weaknesses better than the men who'd built it. The second thing the script did, she hadn't told anyone. Not Cassian, not the informants who'd once fed her fragments of information without knowing what she was building toward. Buried 3 layers deep in the code, disguised as a routine cleanup process, was a second target address, one that didn't belong to Malakor's network at all. It belonged to Cassian's. She'd routed it through the same relay points he used for his own quiet dealings, the same servers Kale maintained, the same financial trail that funded the empire her husband had spent 6 years building without once inviting her to be more than its silent, decorative wife. The script didn't care whose name was on the account. It only cared about erasing the war itself, root and branch, so that neither side would have anything left worth killing over. The lights flickered above her, the same stutter Cassian would notice minutes later from the guest wing, as the mainframe's processors strained under the weight of what she'd unleashed inside them. Then, faintly, an alarm began to sound. Not the sharp electronic wail of a security breach. This was different. A low, mechanical klaxon reserved for system failure. The kind of alarm that told Malakor's tech team something was wrong with the building's core, rather than its perimeter. Soraia allowed herself a small, tired smile as she heard footsteps pounding down a distant corridor, voices rising in confusion rather than coordinated alarm, because nobody yet understood what was happening well enough to know how to stop it. By the time they figured it out, it would already be too late. That had always been the design. She rose from the junction box, coat buttons hanging loose and useless now, their purpose spent, and allowed herself exactly 3 seconds to feel the weight of what she'd just set in motion before she moved again. 3 seconds for 6 years of being dismissed. 3 seconds for every meeting she'd been excluded from, every conversation that had stopped when she entered a room, every time Cassian had looked straight through her like she was part of the furniture. Then she straightened her spine and became once more the quiet woman nobody in this building had ever bothered to fear. Down the hall she could hear Malakor's voice rising above the others, sharp, with a fury that hadn't yet found its target. Somewhere behind her, if the timing held, Cassian and Kale would already be moving through the compound's lower levels, following the sound of the alarm rather than the trail of sheets she'd left hanging from her window. She had 30 minutes. She'd used 11 of them. Soraia slipped back into the shadow of the utility corridor and kept moving toward the server vault at the building's heart, toward the confrontation she'd known from the very first night in that basement workshop was always going to come. The empire her husband had built, and the one that had tried for years to destroy it, were both dying tonight, one corrupted file at a time. And she intended to be standing in the middle of it when they finally understood who had finished them.
Don Malachor reached the guest suite 40 seconds after the alarm began, 3 armed men behind him, and found exactly what he expected to find and nothing he wanted to. The bedsheet cord hung limp against the outer wall, swaying in the storm wind through the open window. The guard outside the door was gone. Not dead, Draven confirmed after a quick check of the supply closet, just unconscious and stripped of his radio, which told Malachor 2 things at once. Someone had come in from outside, and his quiet, broken little houseguest had known exactly when to disappear. "She's not running," Malachor said, and his own calm frightened Draven more than shouting would have. "Running women don't leave the lights flickering behind them." He was already moving before he finished the sentence, cutting through the corridor toward the tech room where 2 of his engineers were shouting over each other at a bank of monitors that had, in the last 2 minutes, gone from green to a solid, spreading red. Malachor didn't need to understand the code scrolling past to understand what he was looking at. He'd built this empire on the assumption that his most valuable secrets sat somewhere no outsider could ever physically touch. Watching that assumption die in real time did something to his face that none of his men had ever seen before. "Trace it," he said, voice flat. "Trace it to the source. Now." It took less than 2 minutes. The engineers pulled up a schematic of the building's internal wiring and followed the corrupted signal backward, floor by floor, until it dead-ended at a second-floor electrical closet that should have contained nothing but breaker switches and dust. Malachor was already halfway there. Soraia heard them coming before she saw them, boots on tile, moving fast, no longer confused, but coordinated, which meant someone had finally connected the alarm to its source. She'd made it 2 corridors past the junction box, close enough to the server vault to see the reinforced door at the end of the hall when Malachor rounded the corner ahead of her, with 3 armed men fanning out on either side. He didn't look surprised to see her. That was almost worse than if he had. "The broken wife," he said quietly, and there was something almost admiring buried underneath the fury in his voice, the tone of a man recognizing, too late, that he'd been outplayed by someone he'd never once considered capable of playing at all. "Cassian's shadow. I had you pegged as the saddest thing to walk through my gates in years." "You had me pegged exactly the way I wanted you to." Soraia didn't retreat, didn't shrink. For the first time since she'd arrived at this compound, she let her spine straighten fully, let her voice carry without the practiced tremor she'd worn like a second coat for 6 days. "That was the entire point." Malachor's jaw tightened. He raised a hand, and the men beside him lifted their weapons in the same motion, trained enough to need no further instruction. "Whatever you've done, you're going to undo it. Or you're going to watch these men take their time about persuading you." "There's nothing left to undo." Soraia held perfectly still, watching the barrel of the nearest gun without flinching, because flinching now would undo 6 days of careful, exhausting work. "It's already gone. The ledgers, the backups, the accounts. By the time your engineers finish confirming what I already know, there won't be a syndicate left standing here to protect." For a long moment, nobody moved. Rain lashed against a window somewhere down the corridor, the mechanical alarm still droning beneath the tension like a held breath. "Then you're no use to me alive," Malachor said, and the calm in his voice was the most dangerous thing about him. "Finish her." The lights went out. All of them, the entire floor, plunged into a blackness so total and so sudden that the storm outside seemed to roar louder in the absence of anything else to hear. Someone shouted. A gun went off into empty air, the muzzle flash strobing the dark for a fraction of a second, illuminating nothing but confusion, and Malachor's men turning in 3 different directions at once. Cassian had found the maintenance bypass exactly where Soraia's blueprints told him it would be. A secondary breaker panel, tucked behind a false wall 2 floors down, marked in her handwriting, with a note he hadn't fully understood until this exact moment. If it ever comes to this, cut it here. He'd trusted her enough to memorize the instruction, without asking why a woman planning a quiet infiltration would need to know how to plunge an entire wing into darkness. Now he understood. She'd planned for this exact moment before she'd ever set foot inside the gates. Kale moved first in the blackness, silent and certain in a way only years of violence could make a man, taking down the nearest guard with a strike Cassian heard more than saw. Cassian went for the second, using the muzzle flash memory burned into his eyes to close the distance before the man could reorient, driving him back into the wall hard enough that his weapon clattered away across the tile. Malakor's voice cut through the chaos, sharp with something that hadn't been there a minute ago. Real fear, the first Cassian had ever heard from him. "Lights! Someone get me the backup power!" "There isn't time," Soraia said, close enough now that Cassian could hear her clearly even without seeing her, and something in his chest unclenched at the sound of her voice, alive, steady, unafraid. "It's already done." A third guard lunged toward the sound of her voice in the dark, and Cassian moved without thinking, closing the gap between them by instinct alone, driven by 6 years of failing to notice her and 1 week of learning exactly how much that failure had cost them both. He reached her a half-second before the guard did, and in the darkness, with alarms screaming and an empire dying in the walls around them, Cassian Vane finally put himself between his wife and a threat, the way he should have, every single day of their marriage, and never once had. The guard went down hard, and in the ringing quiet that followed, Cassian felt Soraia's hand close around his wrist in the dark. Not for support, not out of fear, but with the same steady precision she'd used to draw every line on every blueprint that had gotten him this far. "This way," she said, "before Malakor calls in the men from the docks." Emergency lighting kicked in as they moved, a dim red wash spilling from strips along the baseboards, enough to see shapes and shadows, but little else. Behind them, Malakor was shouting orders that nobody seemed able to follow in the confusion, his voice growing smaller with distance as Soraia led Cassian and Kale through a service passage he never would have found on his own, straight toward the reinforced door at the end of the second-floor corridor. The server vault. Soraia pressed her palm against a panel beside the door, and it hissed open. The same access code she'd extracted weeks ago from a careless engineer who'd never suspected the quiet house guest was memorizing his keystrokes. Inside, the room was chaos given shape. Racks of servers humming and sparking under the strain of a system consuming itself, screens flickering with corrupted data, red warning lights washing the walls in a color that made the whole room look like it was already on fire. "You're still connected." Cassian's eyes found the small device in her hand, still linked by a thin cable to a terminal built into the wall, the same relay chain she'd built from a coat full of buttons and a year of patient planning. "You said it was already done." "The financial wipe is done. This," she gestured at the terminal, her voice tightening with concentration, "is the last of it. Confirmation that nothing survives in a recoverable state. 30 more seconds." Cassian moved to pull her back from the terminal, some old instinct telling him to get her clear of the room before Malakor's men regrouped. But she didn't move, didn't even look up from the screen. "Soraia, we need to go." "Not yet. They'll be here any minute. I said not yet." Her voice cracked through the room sharper than he'd ever heard it, sharper than 6 years of quiet dinners and quieter evenings had ever prepared him for, and something about the force of it made him stop reaching for her. "I have spent a year building this. I am not leaving before I know it's finished." Cassian watched her hands move across the terminal, quick and certain, and understood. Really understood, for the first time since he'd found her ring on that desk,
that the woman standing in front of him had never once needed him to save her. He'd spent 5 days chasing a rescue that didn't exist, building a story in his head where he arrived just in time to pull her from danger. And the truth had been sitting behind his own bookshelf the entire time. She had never been the one in danger. Everyone else had been. The final line of code executed.
The screen went dark, then flickered back with a single confirmation message that Soraia read once, exhaled at, and finally allowed herself to step back from.
"It's done," she said. "Malakor's syndicate has nothing left. No ledgers, no accounts, no proof of anything he's ever done. He's just a man in an expensive building now." Cassian felt something in his chest loosen. Relief, disbelief, 6 years of assumptions collapsing all at once, and reached for her hand. "Then let's move. Kale's got a route out through the loading bays." "Cassian." She didn't take his hand. She looked at him instead, steady, unflinching, in a way she'd never once looked at him across their own dinner table, and he felt the floor shift beneath a marriage he'd thought he understood well enough to walk away from without ever looking back. "There's something else you need to know before we leave this room." "What?" "The wipe wasn't only Malakor's network." For a moment, the words didn't land. The server room hummed around them, red light pulsing steady and slow, and Cassian heard the sentence the way a man hears something underwater, muffled, delayed, wrong. "What are you talking about?" "I built the script to hit 2 targets from the beginning." Her voice didn't waver. If anything, it grew steadier, like she'd rehearsed this exact moment as carefully as she'd rehearsed the broken wife who'd walked through Malakor's gates 6 days ago. "Malakor's ledgers, his accounts, his backups, and yours. Every account, every ledger, every trail connecting your name to anything you've built over the last 15 years. It routed through the same servers Kale maintains. It's gone, Cassian. All of it. Both of you." Cassian stared at her, and for the first time since the war room behind the bookshelf, he felt something colder than betrayal settle into his chest. Not because she'd lied to him, but because he understood, with terrible clarity, exactly why she hadn't. "You didn't come here to save me from him," he said slowly. "You came here to end both of us." "I came here to end the reason you never had time for me." Her eyes didn't leave his, didn't soften, didn't ask for forgiveness she clearly hadn't decided yet whether she wanted. 6 years, Cassian. 6 years I sat in that house and watched you disappear into meetings and wars and men who mattered more to you than I did. And I told myself it was because the stakes were too high for you to slow down. But the stakes were never going to get lower. There was always going to be another Malakor, another war, another reason I came second to something you built with your hands instead of something you built with me. The alarm in the distance kept wailing. Somewhere below them, Kale's voice called out, warning that Malakor's men from the docks were closing in, that they were running out of time to argue about anything at all. Cassian didn't move yet. He looked at his wife, really looked, the way he should have looked every single day for 6 years, and understood that the empire he'd spent his whole life building had just been taken from him by the one person he'd never once considered dangerous enough to watch. "You stripped me of everything," he said quietly. "I stripped you of everything you used to avoid me." Soraia finally reached for his hand herself, pulling him toward the door, toward Kale's voice, toward whatever came next for 2 people who no longer had an empire standing between them. "Now we find out what's left." Kale met them at the stairwell, with blood on his sleeve that wasn't his, and a look on his face that said the conversation Cassian and Soraia had just had would have to wait. "Docks are lighting up," he said, already moving, waving them down the corridor toward the service stairs. "Malakor's calling in everyone he's got left, but half his radios are dead because the comms server just ate itself along with everything else. He's shouting into dead air right now, which is the only reason we're still breathing." "How many men between us and the water?" Cassian asked, falling into step,
forcing the last 5 minutes into some locked compartment in his mind where he could deal with it later, once they were alive long enough for later to matter. Enough. Not as many as there should be. Cale glanced at Soraia with something between suspicion and awe, an expression he hadn't fully settled into yet. Whatever you did up there, it's got half this building running in circles instead of running toward us. That was the idea, Soraia said, and led them down. The loading bays sat 2 floors below the server vault, a cavernous space smelling of salt water and diesel, crates stacked in uneven towers under emergency lighting that pulsed the same dim red as everywhere else in the compound tonight. Soraia moved through it like she'd walked the route 100 times, which, Cassian realized, watching her navigate a gap between 2 shipping containers without hesitation, she probably had, in her mind, sketching escape routes on the same nights she'd sketched guard rotations. They were 50 feet from the water when the first shots came. Draven had rallied 4 men near the loading dock's main doors, close enough to the harbor that Cassian understood immediately why Soraia had angled them toward a smaller side exit instead, a narrow gap between containers that spilled out onto a lesser-used stretch of dock, half hidden from the main approach. It wasn't hidden enough. A round cracked off the shipping container inches from Cale's head, and all 3 of them dropped low, scrambling for the meager cover of stacked crates as gunfire chewed through the space where they'd been standing a second earlier. "Left flank!" Cale shouted, already returning fire with the calm precision of a man who'd done this more times than he could count. "Cassian, get her to the water! I'll hold them!" "Not alone, you won't." Cassian fired twice around the edge of a crate, dropping one of Draven's men, and felt Soraia's hand grip his shoulder. "There's a speedboat," she said, close to his ear, steady even with bullets tearing splinters off the crate above them. "Slip 41. I scouted it my second night here. Malachor keeps it fueled for quick exits. If we can reach it..." "We'll reach it." He didn't know if he believed it. He said it anyway, the way he'd said 100 confident things to men under his command over the years. But this time, it didn't feel like tactics. It felt like the only thing he had left to give her. They broke from cover together, Cale laying down suppressing fire behind them, and Cassian understood in the space of that run, chest burning, rain lashing sideways off the harbor, gunfire cracking somewhere behind them, that he had spent 6 years failing to protect the one person who'd never once needed protecting. And he intended to spend whatever was left of tonight making up for it anyway. Because it wasn't really about whether she needed him. It was about what kind of man he wanted to be, standing beside her. A round caught the crate beside Soraia's head close enough that she flinched, stumbling, and Cassian didn't think. He simply moved, putting his own body between her and the line of fire, absorbing the next impact against his shoulder with a grunt that tore through his teeth. The vest beneath his jacket held. Barely. Enough. Soraia's eyes went wide, her hand catching his arm, something in her expression cracking open for the first time all night. Not the calculated stillness of a woman running an operation, but raw, unguarded fear, entirely for him. "Cassian, I'm fine. Move." He pushed her forward, and for once in 6 years, she let him lead. The 2 of them crossing the last stretch of dock together, while Draven's remaining men scattered under the weight of Cale's covering fire, and the growing realization, spreading through the compound behind them, that there was no functioning chain of command left to organize a real pursuit. The speedboat sat exactly where Soraia had promised, rocking against its mooring in the storm chop, keys already in the ignition, because Malachor's men had never imagined anyone would need to steal it in a hurry. Cassian got Soraia aboard first, then turned back toward the dock, watching for Cale's silhouette in the rain and gunfire. He appeared a moment later, sprinting the last stretch with 2 of Draven's men falling behind him, unwilling to follow him into open water under a hail of return fire. Cassian hauled him aboard as Soraia gunned the engine, and the boat tore away from the dock into the black harbor water, leaving the compound's chaos behind in a spray of white foam and dying floodlights. For a long stretch, nobody spoke. The storm had begun to ease, rain thinning to a mist over the water, the lights of Malakor's fortress shrinking behind them into something that looked, from this distance, almost small. Cassian sat with his back against the boat's rail, shoulder throbbing where the round had caught the vest, and watched Soraia at the wheel, soaked, steady, alive, a woman he'd been married to for 6 years and had somehow never truly met until the week she left him. "You could have told me," he said finally, quiet enough that only she could hear it over the engine. "About the Empire, about what the wipe would cost me." "Would you have let me finish it if I had?" He didn't answer right away because he wasn't sure of the honest response, and after everything tonight, he owed her nothing less than honesty. "I don't know," he admitted. "I like to think so. I'm not certain I would have been that man a week ago." Soraia glanced at him, rain still dripping from her hair, something unreadable passing behind her eyes. "Then it's a good thing," she said. "I never gave you the choice." The safe house Cale found them before dawn belonged to nobody in particular, a fisherman's cottage on the edge of the city that had changed hands through enough backroom deals over the years that its true owner existed only on paper. It had running water, dry blankets, and a door that locked, which was more than any of them had expected to have by sunrise. Cassian didn't sleep. He sat at the small kitchen table while the storm finally broke outside, watching gray light creep in through a salt-stained window, turning over the night in his mind the way he used to turn over a difficult negotiation, looking for the angle he'd missed. Except this time, there was no angle. Soraia had done exactly what she'd set out to do, and the man who'd once prided himself on always knowing what was coming had never seen any of it until it was already finished. By the third day, word had reached him through what remained of his network, thin now, unreliable, half his usual channels gone dark along with the accounts that used to fund them. Malakor's organization was in open collapse. Without ledgers to prove ownership of anything, without accounts to pay his men, without the financial backbone that had held his empire together for 2 decades, lieutenants were peeling away in every direction, some fleeing the city outright, others quietly approaching whatever was left of Cassian's people to ask what came next. The answer, Cassian realized on the 4th day, was that he didn't know either. He'd lost the same things Malakor had lost. The war that had defined half his adult life had ended not with a victory, but with the simple, absolute removal of anything left to fight over. He called the meeting for the 10th day, at a stretch of neutral ground on the city's northern edge that both syndicates had used for uneasy truces in years past. A warehouse district nobody claimed, chosen precisely because no one there had the leverage anymore to claim anything. The regional bosses who showed up were smaller men than Malakor had been, the survivors and opportunists who'd carved out pieces of the 2 collapsing empires in the chaotic days since the harbor breach. They watched Cassian with wary curiosity as he walked into the room without an entourage, without the usual show of armed men lining the walls, just Cale a few steps behind him, and nothing else. "I know what you're all waiting to hear," Cassian said, and let the silence stretch a moment before he gave it to them. "I'm out." A few exchanged glances. One of the older men, a wiry, sun-browned smuggler named Osric, who'd survived 3 regime changes by never picking a side too early, leaned forward. "Out meaning what, exactly?" "Out meaning I'm ceding my territory. All of it. The docks, the warehouses, the routes north of the river. I'm not fighting anyone for them, and I'm not defending them either." Cassian let that land, watching the room recalculate in real time. "There's nothing left to inherit from me but headaches. No ledgers, no accounts, no leverage. Whatever you want to build from what's left, you're building it from nothing, same as everyone else standing in this room." "Why would you walk away from everything you built?" Osric asked, genuine confusion under the suspicion in his voice, the question of a man who couldn't imagine choosing to be small again after spending a life fighting to be large. Cassian thought of Soraia, back at the cottage, healing from 6 days of running on nerve and precision alone,
and found the answer came easier than he expected. "Because I already lost the only thing that ever mattered," he said, "and it took me far too long to notice it was slipping away. I'm not interested in rebuilding an empire to fill that hole. I'd rather spend whatever time I have left figuring out how not to make the same mistake twice." Nobody in the room fully understood what he meant, and he didn't explain further. It wasn't for them. The meeting dissolved faster than any negotiation he'd sat through in 15 years. Men who'd arrived expecting a fight for territory, instead watching Cassian Vane simply walk away from the table entirely, leaving Malakor's remaining lieutenants, the few who'd bothered to show, hollow-eyed and desperate, with nothing left to war over. Without Cassian's territory to covet, and without Malakor's records to weaponize against each other, the old feud had nowhere left to root itself. By the time the room emptied, it was already clear the war that had defined the waterfront for a generation had simply run out of reasons to continue. Kale fell into step beside him as they walked out into weak afternoon sunlight, the first clear sky the city had seen in over a week. "You know, most of them think you've lost your mind," Kale said. "Most of them are probably right. What happens now? To you, I mean. Not the territory. You." Cassian considered the question longer than he expected to need. 15 years of his life had been organized entirely around the answer to a different question: how to hold on to power, how to stay one step ahead of men who wanted to take it from him. And he found, standing in a sunlit warehouse district with nothing left to defend, that he genuinely didn't know what came next without that question driving him. "I don't know yet," he admitted. "I know I'm not going back to what I was. I don't think I could, even if I wanted to. There's nothing left to go back to." "And Soraia?" Cassian's jaw tightened, not from anger, but from something closer to uncertainty than he was used to feeling about anything. She'd barely spoken to him since the boat, polite and distant in the small cottage, tending her own wounds and his, without ever quite meeting his eyes for longer than necessary. "I don't know that either," he said honestly. "But I know I'm not done trying to find out." Kale clapped a hand on his shoulder, the closest thing to encouragement either of them had ever been comfortable offering the other, and the two men walked out of the last territory Cassian Vane would ever call his own, without looking back. It took Cassian 3 weeks to find her. Not because she'd hidden well, though she had, thoroughly, the way she did everything, but because he'd made himself wait. He'd spent 6 years failing to give her the attention she deserved while she was standing right in front of him. Showing up on her doorstep the moment he had a lead felt like one more version of the same mistake, chasing her out of urgency instead of understanding. So he waited until he had something better to offer than urgency. The coastal town she'd chosen sat 4 hours north of the city, small enough that everyone knew everyone, the kind of place where a woman with no criminal history and a modest amount of very clean money could open a little shop selling handmade goods and simply disappear into an ordinary life. Cassian found the shop on a quiet street 2 blocks from the water, a narrow storefront with a hand-painted sign, warm light spilling through the window in the late afternoon, and through the glass, Soraia behind the counter, sleeves rolled up, laughing at something a customer had said. He stood outside for a long time before he went in. She wasn't wearing velvet. That was the first thing he noticed. A plain cotton dress, sensible shoes, hair pulled back loosely instead of tucked beneath the heavy coats she'd hidden behind for 6 years of marriage. She looked lighter here, not thinner, not different in the ways that had never mattered, but unburdened in a way he'd never once seen at Villa Vane, where every soft edge of her had been wrapped in silence and low expectations she'd built for herself precisely because nobody had ever asked her to be more. The bell over the door announced him before she saw his face, and when she did, everything in her expression stilled at once. Surprise, wariness, something underneath both that he chose to believe, standing in the doorway with his heart hammering harder than it ever had walking into gunfire, might still be hope.
"You found me," she said. "I stopped looking 3 weeks ago. I wanted to give you the time." He stayed near the door, hands loose at his sides. No entourage, no weapon, nothing of the man who'd once walked into rooms expecting them to rearrange themselves around him. "I only came today because I finally had something worth saying." The customer at the counter, sensing the weight in the room, made a quiet excuse and slipped out. Soraia didn't move from behind the counter, arms crossing loosely over her chest, giving nothing away. "Say it then." Cassian had rehearsed this on the drive up, discarded every version that sounded like a man asking for something back, because that wasn't what he'd come to do. He didn't want the wife who'd waited quietly in the East Wing sitting room for 6 years. He didn't want the woman who'd built herself small enough to be overlooked, because he understood now that every year of that smallness had cost her something he'd never bothered to notice her losing. "I'm not here to ask you to come home," he said. "I don't have a home to bring you back to, not really. I gave away the last of it 10 days after the harbor, and even if I still had it, I don't think it's what either of us needs." "Then why are you here?" "Because I spent 6 years married to you without ever once wondering who you actually were. I told myself I loved you, and maybe some part of me did, but it was the kind of love that doesn't require looking too closely at the person it's aimed at. You could have been anyone behind that quiet, and I wouldn't have noticed the difference, because I never once made the effort to find out." Soraia's arms loosened slightly, though her expression stayed guarded. "That's a hard thing to admit." "It's a harder thing to live with, now that I know it." Cassian took one step further into the shop, no closer than felt honest, giving her the space to close the distance herself if she wanted to. "I'm not the man who ran an empire anymore. I don't have captains, or territory, or leverage over anyone. I don't have anything to offer you that would impress a single person who used to answer to me. What I have is time. More of it than I've had in 15 years. And I'd like to spend some of it here, if you'll let me. Not as your husband demanding a place beside you, but as someone asking to earn it. As an equal. However long that takes." The shop was quiet, except for the distant sound of gulls outside, the late sun slanting warm across the wooden floor between them. "You're asking my permission," Soraia said slowly, like she was testing the shape of the idea. "Instead of assuming you already have it." "I'm asking because I finally understand the difference." Cassian held her gaze, steady, without the armor he'd worn into every negotiation of his old life. "You spent 6 years giving me a version of yourself small enough not to threaten anything I'd built. I don't want that woman back. I want to know the one who mapped a fortress from memory and walked into it alone because she trusted her own mind more than she ever trusted me to see her. If she's willing to let me try." For a long moment, Soraia said nothing at all, studying him the way she'd once studied blueprints, patient, thorough, searching for the flaw that would tell her whether this was worth the risk. Then, slowly, she came out from behind the counter, crossing the small distance between them, and stopped close enough that he could see the years of careful calculation finally settle into something softer in her eyes. "You can stay in town," she said. "Not with me, not yet, but close enough to prove it, if you meant what you said." It wasn't everything. It wasn't the ending he might have imagined a lifetime ago, back when he still believed love was something you assumed rather than something you built. But it was a foundation offered freely by a woman who had never once needed him to save her. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Cassian Vane was grateful for exactly what he'd been given, instead of grieving everything he'd lost.